Now, Philippe, Crist, the stage is yours, and you'll have your presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian, for a very good introduction. Complexities of what we're going to be looking at, and I especially appreciate the view that there isn't one single future, and there won't be one single option. There won't be one single future, there won't be one single pathway, there won't be one single option when we look at how automated, lower automation, higher automation, and fully self-automated vehicles will deploy in our cities. But what I'd like today is to talk about one potential scenario that is just one slice of what Bryant just talked about. And it's based on work that we've done at the International Transport Forum, looking at, as I said, a potential yet plausible transport system that is radically different in our cities than the one that we now experience. But before I do that, I'd like to give a bit of context setting, because we had a speaker cancel. And that context setting is about a major caveat about what it is that we are making our decisions for. And this deals with both the role of the urban and the role of the human in our cities and in our transport planning. Now, cities are hugely popular. They cover less than 5% of the world's surface, concentrate more than 50% of the global population, 70% of wealth production, and an equal share of greenhouse gas emissions. Cities concentrate opportunity and access. But it's important to remember that 30% of the world's urban areas are comprised of low-income, informal dwellings in favelas, shantytowns, slums, and other marginal residential and commercial spaces. People crowd into cities because for both the rich and for the poor, cities are formidable economic accelerants. They build on the ease of access to labor and jobs, and on the one hand, and to ideas and creativity on the other. But cities are also spaces. And when we take away the buildings in our cities, we're left with a lattice dominated by the space allocated to transport, mobility, and movement. And though these are important functions in our cities, they're not the only function for the space between our buildings. And I'd like to remind us that the cities that we get when we only focus on how well this space serves vehicles can be rather inhospitable places for humans. And this is unfortunate, because the strength of our cities, the strength of our society, rests upon the people that are at the heart of both. Before speaking about automated vehicle systems, about automated transport in the cities and towns of the 21st century, I think we need to first talk about the cities and towns of this century and about the trips that we'll make there. Now, a rough back-of-the-envelope calculation points to 400 trillion trips being made by the human species going forward to 2050, as we grow to 9 billion people in the world. 54 trillion of these trips are trips we're not taking today. These are trips that are based on population growth. 94% of these new trips will take place in emerging countries, and nearly every single one of these trips will take place, new trips will take place in a city. These trips will accompany population growth. This is actually a map of the world, but you can't see the background, but you can situate it. And looking to the recent past and near-term future, we see that not only will the 21st century be the urban century, it will also be the Asian, African, and Latin American century. Now, this population growth here in the world has been accompanied by rapid increase in the built-up areas of urban areas. This is the Yangtze River Delta in China, and looking at the expansion, the urban expansion between the year 2000 and 2010, we see that this population growth is accompanied by a major growth in the occupation of land. This growth will pose formidable challenges for urban governance and sustainability if we do not become better at handling the mobility and access conundrum in our urban areas. And we have to do this in places like the streets of Jakarta, in spaces like here in the Paris subway system. This, unfortunately, is my own experience. Or even on the bicycle tracks of this country in the Netherlands. And so in our study, we decided to look, as I said, to a potentially disruptive future urban transport pathway that could improve this access in our cities, and that starts with one simple fact. And that is that cars are used for less than 1 hour per day in general within OECD countries, and surprisingly, a similar amount of time in many developing countries. The fact that we put up with such inefficiency just reveals how much we value the convenience that individual motorized transport provides. Cars are not the only underused asset that we have, that individuals have and that businesses have. Homes, Wi-Fi bandwidth, office space often also lie underused. And for all of these goods, the advent of network technologies has facilitated the sharing of unused capacity among individuals and among businesses. Car and ride sharing is squarely at the heart of the shared economy, with dozens of operators, both legacy and new entrants, operating a wide range of service. And tellingly, a number of these operators are well-capitalized automakers, rental companies, and the largest capitalized IT transport firm in the world, Uber. But one thing that all of these services have in common is that they still require a driver behind the wheel. Now, with the arrival of highly automated and ultimately fully self-driving cars on our roads, this could radically change. While many car makers take a same as it ever was approach, which is not only a great song by the Talking Heads, but it seems to be the dominant paradigm when we look at how these type of technology changes will change urban transport. That is, they look at this arrival, and this is what Bryant was talking about earlier, and imagine that we will still use this technology much as the Jetsons used flying cars in their show and as we do today use cars individually. That was not our expectation, nor is it our starting point. Our same as ever was approach is not sufficient, I think, to describe the potential future. So what we looked at was a what-if exercise. What if every single trip in a mid-sized European city was replaced by a shared self-driving fleet of vehicles? Bryant said the transition is extremely challenging. And so in the best possible tradition of early research, we decided to not look at the transition and look only at the fully built out scenario. And we did this because we wanted to gauge what would be the range of impacts and what would be the type of impacts that could be expected from this. So don't expect this, what I'm going to present here, to be an accurate description of one highly possible route. It is just to delineate what we could expect from these type of technologies, all in being developed in a city. And we started at first with a real city, in this case Lisbon, with its street topology, traffic rules. We also looked at real data on origins and destinations and crucially the timing of travel based on the origin destination travel survey for that city. And we used real routes to plot the travel between these origins and destinations at the same time of day that they were taking place, at least in this case in 2010. We plotted these routes on a shortest route basis, but also took in place some of the real behavioral route making in the city of Lisbon. And we also modeled the system so it delivered the same, if not better quality trips than today's car trips. So door-to-door convenience, similar waiting times, travel times as well, but we also eliminated the need to worry about parking. We modeled 2 vehicle configurations. One, a ride-sharing taxibot. This is actually a trademark name, so this might not be called taxibot much longer. And this is a simultaneous sharing of a taxi-like service with no driver. And we also modeled autovots. This is a sequential sharing of a vehicle where the vehicle again, driverless, picks up a passenger or a party, drops that party off, then repositions and picks up another passenger. Now, the taxi bots pick up and deliver optimized passengers in real time, and so they are loading and unloading passengers. For each of these, the vehicles were 2, 4, and 8-person capacity vehicles. We accounted for the presence or not of high-capacity public transport. In this case, it was the Lisbon metro system. We assumed, as I said earlier, that all bus trips were assigned to the shared self-driving fleet. Trips of under 1 kilometer were assumed to be walkable, and therefore they were assigned to be walked, although this clearly is not the case today. We didn't model cycling. Unfortunately, Lisbon is not a very high cycling city, largely due to its topography. And we looked at the impacts over the course of the day, both at peak periods and over the average time of the day. Now, one of the things we wanted to do is see if a system like the ones that we're describing could deliver the same mobility. And when we said the same mobility, it had to be close enough. We modeled all trips in the simulation, so they were started with no more than a 5-minute delay from the original base case trip, and such that each trip's duration did not surpass the base case trip by more than 20%, capped at 10 minutes. And also, the trip's length did not surpass the base case trip by more than 20% as well, capped at an additional 2 kilometers. So we felt confident that this was not the same level of mobility, but it was close enough. And this is what we found. In the case of a scenario with the ride-sharing taxi bots, public transport, over 24 hours, these systems could deliver every single trip in the city of Lisbon, but with 90% fewer vehicles. That is, you could remove 9 out of 10 vehicles and still offer the same-ish level of mobility as I described earlier. This is a significant effect, but it's not a surprising effect, because there have been a number of other studies that have tried to model what these type of fleets would deliver. And we've seen this from work at MIT, in Singapore, in New York, other studies in Texas, and a new study being done in the Paris region. So these are largely consistent fleet reduction effects. When we looked at peak periods, we saw that 2 out of 3 vehicles could be removed from the city streets and still allow the same-ish level of mobility as I described earlier. Now, one thing is that it's clear that these fleet reduction impacts will have significant repercussions on parking needs and the allocation of public space in our cities. In all of the scenarios that we studied, we found that on-street parking could be completely removed, allowing for the reallocation of 1.5 million square meters in the city. This is equivalent to about 210 football pitches, or twice the area of the Vatican, or 20% of the curb-to-curb street space in the city. Now, freeing up such a significant share of space leads to new and previously unimaginable possibilities. Alternative uses like expanding public space, like here parklets in Philadelphia, but we've seen them in a number of other cities around the world, could be a much more popular and much more feasible option. Or freeing up space for walking and cycling. I should say that in our scenarios, the added convenience of having a door-to-door individual transport system will potentially have repercussions on the number of people walking and cycling. And there are both traffic benefits, but certainly even more important, health benefits related to that. So as we think of how these systems could shape our cities, we cannot lose sight of the fact that we still have to retain and even increase the number of people cycling and walking in our cities. Or another use could be for commercial deliveries or remunerated commercial uses. Now, most cities also devote considerable space to surface and underground off-street parking. And we found that in our scenarios, up to 80% of that capacity would be superfluous and could be released for other uses. In the most favorable case, about 1.2 million meters of space, this is about almost the same, 170 football pitches as the street space liberated, could be used potentially for logistics redistribution centers. Why not delivering vehicles that were self-driving as well? Now, those were the space reduction and the fleet impacts. In terms of volume of travel, It may very well be that this type of fleet of shared self-driving cars these fleets will travel more than today's fleet of cars and buses. And this is because these vehicles are assumed to replace all bus travel, but especially because the additional travel required for repositioning, pickups, and drop-offs in the system. With the high-capacity public transport system and the taxi-bot, the simultaneous ride-sharing system, we see an increase of 6% to 44%, depending on, in this case, with the Autobot scenario. 44% might be challenging to manage, although we expect that such a system would also deliver better efficiencies in the use of that space. When we look at the peak hour impacts, we see the range of impacts are about the same, 8% to 54% more in the case of the Autobot scenario with public transport. But when we take away public transport, all bets are off, because in this case, you would see a doubling of the amount of kilometers traveled in the city. This would be extremely challenging, possibly impossible to manage. Now, we looked at where on the road network this increase would take place, and we looked by roadway type in this city. In terms of occupancy of the road's technical carrying capacity, we see that in the base case morning peak, all but local roads operate at an average of about 30 to 40% of their capacity. In the taxi-bot plus high-capacity public transport scenarios, we see that the major part of the increase occurs on local roads. And in the Autobot, so in the car-sharing scenario, without high-capacity public transport, we see that traffic on local roads could potentially more than double. And this means that the types of scenario we modeled would lead to an increase in traffic in parts of the city where significant traffic was largely absent previously. This relative increase would certainly cause discomfort for those who live there and lead also to a rise in conflicts with pedestrians and cyclists. Now, after this initial round of work, we asked ourselves, could we do better, especially on the VKM findings? And we looked at some tweaks and improvements we could generate in our dispatching algorithm, and we found that we could improve it by reducing the amount of early reservation time that was necessary. We also modified the acceptable delays that were accepted by the system, and we also created a new shared self-driving mode. And for this, we looked to Helsinki and to a few other cities that have put in place real-time, on-demand, optimized bus services, like here, Kutsu Plus in Helsinki. We modeled 2 classes of self-driving taxi buses, either 8-person or 16-person vehicles, that have to be pre-booked 30 minutes in advance. And upon booking the trip, the passenger receives a confirmation and directions to a pop-up virtual stop. They're no longer fixed stops in the city, where the bus will pick them up. And the dispatching system will also specify a pickup time that could be up to 10 minutes after the requested time. Compared to, I hesitate to call them legacy buses, but compared to today's buses, this service offers significant benefits: shorter waiting times, shorter access distances, no transfers, and most importantly, guaranteed seats. In our modeling, we assign passengers to these taxi buses based on trip characteristics, time of day, and the convenience factor offered by this service versus the shared taxi trips. And what we found is that this system, taxi bots, taxi buses, public transport, could reduce the number of cars on the road by 95%, so 50% reduction on what we saw earlier with just the taxi bots and the shared public transport system. But now, considering that 67% of the shared self-driving trips in this scenario are run by taxi bots and 33% by the taxi buses, it should come as no surprise that you see a large increase in the number of buses running in our cities. These are both 8-person and 16-person smaller minibuses, not the 80-person larger buses that we had before. And they also operate at much higher load factors. When we looked at how this system could deliver the number of kilometers traveled, we saw that we would, over the course of the day, see a 15% reduction in the number of VKM, and at peak hours, a 22% reduction in VKM. So the same or same-ish mobility with far less travel and far less congestion. We didn't model the safety impacts, but we did assume these to be substantial. What we did see is that the CO2 reduction impact was quite large, about a 30% reduction. And this is all with conventional internal combustion engine technology. We looked at an electric vehicle fleet. And what we saw there is that the efficiency or the added vehicles required due to the range issues and also due to the time off for charging would be minimal. So what were the key policy considerations that we saw coming out of this exercise? The first is that we have to anticipate that such a system will have an impact, could possibly have an impact on the way in which space is used in the city and the amount of space that's dedicated, in this case especially to parking vehicles. And that has to be anticipated and planned for, because it could be that cities will find themselves in a situation where those benefits are eroded because of the lack of foresight and the lack of action. We also saw that the benefits, positive and negative, are linked to system design, and this will matter. You can design a system that leads to increased VKM or decreased VKM. But even more importantly, market design will matter. And this is important for public authorities, because you can imagine such a system being a single monopoly operator in a city, much like a public transport system is today in many cases, or multiple different competing operators. In the latter case, with an open market competition in the city for the same type of service, what I showed earlier in terms of increase in vehicle kilometers would be small compared to what you would see then, a huge increase in vehicle kilometers. And this is something that cities have to be concerned about, and cities should anticipate in terms of the way in which they set up their concessioning contracts and rules for operation for these type of systems should they come about on the roads. One thing also that we saw, and this was something that came out of the work that Bryant had done earlier, is that we see little evidence that cities, jurisdictions, countries are thinking about the use cases for these vehicles. Most of the regulatory focus has been and should be on how safe these vehicles are to operate, where they should operate, what are the standards that we should require for these self-driving vehicles operation. And that is something that we tell our member countries is important, but should be accompanied with a focus on the potential use cases for these vehicles, because these will have significant repercussions on the day-to-day business of regulating traffic and land use in cities. And of course, what I've presented here and what we already see in our streets in the terms of new types of taxi-like services is that these services will compete directly with public transport as we operate it today, with taxi services, and yet we still have not yet found the regulatory formula for allowing even competition amongst these, still delivering public mandates on security, safety, and consumer protection, and espousing a pro-innovative approach. This is something, again, that we have to accelerate in terms of the anticipatory action that regulators will put into place. Regulatory adaptation is one of the key aspects that came out of this. We at the ITF are starting to work on this, but we expect that there will be a merging of public transport, taxi, and new type of service regulation probably within most of your lifetimes. New business models are required. We're not sure who will be delivering those. We're not sure how we're going to regulate them, but new vehicles will also be required. And that's clear because the number of hours that these vehicles are being used increases tremendously, and the type of interior fittings that you see on these vehicles will be vastly different than those that we see today. And before I finish on this last point about data, I'd also like to say that our recent work has indicated that when we entered into this sort of research question, the focus was on the self-driving component. But what we found is that the greatest impacts come not from the self-driving aspect. The greatest impacts come from the sharing and ride optimization side. And why that is important is because self-driving vehicles might be 10 years away, they might be 20 years away, but this aspect, the shared aspect of this technology is here today. And so there's much that can be done already to start thinking about how do we better allocate, better manage these type of services, public transport, taxis, et cetera, in our cities using existing technologies. We don't have to wait for the self-driving technology to be sufficiently vetted by authorities. And the last thing is that, of course, I don't mean this literally, but there is a huge amount of data that will be required for this, a huge amount of data that will be both generated and potentially usable from these type of systems. And one area that we know we're not ready is the adequate protection, regulatory protection of location-based data. And this is an area where governments will also have to be quite active if they want to leverage the type of benefits that I've presented here. They cannot be focusing only on the transport task. This task has to fit into a broader discussion and a broader regulatory revisit of the way in which, especially location-based data, is being used by our cities, by operators, and by governments. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe, Crist, and Brian. Please come back. So now we'll take some questions and comments on what you've just heard.